So, imagine the American heartland, the Great Plains, the absolute breadbasket of the world, thousands of massive grain silos, millions of bushels of golden wheat, a harvest worth billions of dollars. Then, the flow stops. Not from a drought, not from a flood, not from a market crash, a structural revelation. The elevators in North Dakota are hitting capacity. The trucks in Montana are backed up for miles. The grain is starting to rot in the open air. 78 million metric tons of American exports paralyzed. $19 billion in global contracts in immediate default. This is not a policy failure. This is not a diplomatic friction point. This is a systemic collapse of the most basic logistical assumption in Washington. They signed a tariff. They declared a victory. They performed for the cameras. But they forgot to check the deed to the road. They forgot about physics. Hit subscribe because what happened next is the moment the world's largest economy discovered that its power means nothing when someone else owns the tracks. Washington is blinded by finance. They focus on the deficit. They track the currency. They monitor the stock tickers. This is a systemic strategic oversight. They assume the global market is a digital ledger. They forgot it is a physical network. They traded strategic reality for administrative arrogance. The United States is the largest grain exporter on earth. 400 million tons produced annually. Wheat, corn, soybeans. Roughly a quarter of that production must reach the Pacific. It must reach Japan. It must reach South Korea. It must reach the massive demand of Southeast Asia. These are the premium markets. These are the growth sectors. These are the absolute lifeblood of the American heartland. Now, look at the map. Look at the steel. Look at the physics. The most efficient route for American wheat is not American. The most cost-effective artery for Montana corn is not American. The primary corridor for the American breadbasket runs through Canada, through Canadian National, through Canadian Pacific Kansas City, through the deep water terminals of Vancouver and Prince Rupert. This was a rational economic choice. For 30 years, American shippers chose Canadian infrastructure. They chose it because it was better. They chose it because it was faster. They chose it because it was cheaper. American West Coast ports became congested. They became aging. They became inadequate for the volume. The investment gap created a logistical dependency. Washington designed a strategic confrontation as if the infrastructure was a neutral utility. They assumed the road was a public right. They assumed the rails were a permanent entitlement. They believed they could weaponize the policy without losing the priority. They brought a contract to a fight over a bridge. They brought a spreadsheet to a fight over a terminal. No buffer, no backup, no plan B. They applied volatile regulatory pressure to a neighbor who holds the keys to their own exports. They treated the landlord like a subordinate. They forgot that you cannot export food if you do not control the tracks. They forgot that physics does not recognize a tariff. They forgot that an economy is only as powerful as the infrastructure that allows it to breathe. Ottawa did not retaliate with a tariff. Retaliation is for dealers. Ottawa executed a regulatory pivot, a national infrastructure priority directive, clinical language, devastating impact. The directive was simple. Canadian infrastructure must serve Canadian priorities first, not a ban, not a sanction, not an act of aggression, a sovereign administrative reallocation. Canadian grain moved to the front of the line. Canadian potash claimed the priority slots. Freight from partners with active trade agreements, Europe, Japan, India, received immediate clearance. The United States, the partner in a state of strategic confrontation, was moved to the back of the queue. The legal foundation was unassailable. No nation is obligated to provide transit infrastructure to a foreign power. No international agreement requires Canada to subsidize American logistics during a confrontation. Ottawa did not block the trade. They simply prioritized the owners. This is the difference between policy and physics. A tariff adds cost. A priority shift removes the road. If the capacity is finite and the priority is local, the outsider is silenced. Washington thought they were negotiating a price. Ottawa proved they were managing a queue. The trains still exist, the tracks are still clear. But for American grain, the signal is permanently red. The system backed up like a highway with every exit closed. The grain elevators across the northern Great Plains reached capacity in 14 days. These facilities are transit points, not warehouses, not storage hubs. They were built for movement. When the movement stopped, the architecture failed. Trucks lined up at elevators that could not accept delivery. Farmers piled wheat on the ground under tarps, a desperate measure, a futile attempt to slow the spoilage, a visible symbol of a systemic collapse. This is the part Washington did not calculate. You can subsidize a price. You cannot subsidize a railroad into existence, not in a month, not in a year. The economic fallout was clinical. Farmgate prices in North Dakota dropped 31% in 3 weeks. Corn basis levels in Iowa hit negative territory. Soybean futures cratered. This was not a market correction. This was a logistical dependency failure. The global response was immediate, and it was final. Japanese buyers invoked force majeure. They redirected purchases to Australia. South Korean importers shifted to Brazil. Chinese state buyers accelerated their pivot to Canadian and Argentine supply chains. Every contract lost was a relationship severed. Every relationship severed was a market share surrendered. Commerce does not wait for a diplomatic resolution. Commerce moves to the path of least resistance. The American heartland became a stranded asset, a trapped resource, an economy without an exit. Washington created the friction. Ottawa provided the bypass. American farmers are watching their harvest rot because the policy was paper, but the tracks are steel. This is the ultimate irony, a self-inflicted wound, a systemic strategic failure. Washington launched a confrontation to protect the heartland. Instead, they subsidized the rival. Look at the ships, look at the manifests, look at the flags. While American grain sat in silos, Canadian export volume surged 23% in the first 30 days. The same quality, the same Pacific access, the same Asian buyers, Australian wheat, Brazilian corn, Argentine soy. These competitors did not win on price. They did not win on technology. They won on the road. Washington's policy acted as a direct marketing campaign for its global rivals. They removed the American producer from the board. They prioritized the Canadian infrastructure for Canadian interests. They locked the American farmer out of the future. The tariff was designed to punish the neighbor. The reality was a massive transfer of market share, a transfer that will take a generation to reverse. Relationships in grain markets are built on reliability, on consistency, on the certainty of the delivery. The Australian cooperative showed up when the American elevator was closed. The Brazilian conglomerate delivered when the American railcar was sidelined. This is not a temporary shift. This is a structural replacement. Commerce finds the path of least resistance, and right now the path is no longer American. Let us look at this through the lens of pure capital. Enter the philosophy of Warren Buffett, the ultimate auditor of value, the man who owns the tracks. When Berkshire Hathaway acquired BNSF Railway for $44 billion, the world watched. They saw a railroad. Buffett saw a moat. He saw an asset that cannot be replicated, a position that cannot be competed away, a physical certainty in a world of financial abstractions. He called it an all-in bet on the American economy because he understood one fundamental truth. Everything else is built on top of the infrastructure, not an app, not a stock, a foundation. There are two kinds of leverage in global economics: policy leverage and infrastructure leverage. Policy leverage is what governments write on paper: tariffs, sanctions, regulations, executive orders. It is fast, it is loud, it is fragile. You can create a policy overnight. You can reverse a policy with a single signature. It is a tool of the dealer, a tool of the short-term transaction. It is a performance for the cameras. Infrastructure leverage is what decades of investment build in steel and concrete. Rails, ports, terminals, bridges. This is permanent. This is absolute. This is the bedrock of reality. It takes 30 years to build. It cannot be replicated by any policy. It cannot be willed into existence by any executive order. It cannot be bought by any amount of money on a timeline that matters to the people suffering right now. These are not equivalent forms of power. Infrastructure leverage is the landlord, policy leverage is the tenant, and Washington just started a fight with the owner of the road. Buffett understands switching costs. In most industries, if the price goes up, the customer moves. They find a new vendor, they find a new brand, they find a new solution. The market is elastic, there is a choice. But what is the elasticity of a transcontinental rail corridor? What is the switching cost of a deep water port terminal when your harvest is rotting in the fields? The answer is zero. The switching cost is physics. To build an alternative rail route from the American Midwest to American Pacific ports would take a minimum of 10 years. It would cost $40 billion. It would require environmental reviews. It would require land acquisitions. It would require engineering plans. It would require a decade of construction. No executive order can compress that timeline. No political rhetoric can accelerate that physics. No amount of anger can lay a single mile of track. Washington brought temporary leverage to a fight against permanent leverage. They brought a contract to a fight over a bridge. The contract says whatever the politician wants it to say, but the person who owns the bridge decides who crosses. And right now, Canada owns the bridge. Not metaphorically, literally, the rails, the terminals, the port facilities. They are Canadian property. They were built with Canadian capital. They are maintained by Canadian labor. They are located on Canadian soil. No tariff changes that. No sanction changes that. No trade negotiation changes that. Buffett's audit is final. Washington thought trade power was about the size of the total economy. They thought the larger GDP dictated the terms. They were wrong. Leverage is not about the size of the engine. It is about the ownership of the tracks. Control the choke point and you control the economy. Control the road and you control the destination. Washington acted like they owned the underlying asset, but they only leased the output. They confused a commercial privilege with a sovereign right. They treated a strategic dependency as a political entitlement. They assumed the neighbor was a servant. They discovered the neighbor is the landlord. Washington just shorted physics, and physics always calls the margin. Every trade war in history has been won or lost by the control of the choke points, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Panama Canal, and now the Canadian rail corridors to the Pacific. You can survive a tariff. You can adjust to a tax. You can absorb a financial penalty. You cannot survive the loss of your route to market. Once the road is closed, the economy stops breathing. Once the tracks are silent, the harvest is worthless. Washington thought they were playing a game of numbers. They were actually playing a game of geography. And they forgot to look at the map. Read that again. Washington just shorted physics. And the bill just came due back in Ottawa. A quiet press conference. No theatrical triumph. No geopolitical grandstanding. No signatures of anger. Mark Carney stands at the podium. He does not lament a broken alliance. He does not celebrate an economic victory. He speaks with the clinical calm of a manager who has audited the ledger and found a discrepancy. He addresses the suffering in the American heartland. He speaks to the farmers in North Dakota and Montana. He calls them neighbors. He calls them partners. He expresses genuine empathy for the harvest rotting in the fields. But the empathy is framed by a harder reality, a sovereign reality. He states that Canadian infrastructure must serve Canadian priorities. It must protect Canadian values. It must secure the Canadian future. This is the final audit. Washington assumed size equals leverage. They believed a larger economy could dictate the physical terms of a continent. They were wrong. Leverage is not about magnitude. Leverage is structural. Leverage is about who controls the door between the producer and the world. The United States spent 18 months fighting a trade war with paper. Canada ended it with steel. The tariffs made headlines. The rail directive made history. Power means nothing when you do not control the road. And the road was built, owned, and locked before Washington even realized they were the tenant. Mark Carney delivered the 6 words that redefined the power dynamic of North America. 6 words that captured the absolute reality of a systemic dependency. 6 words that will be studied in every war college and trade ministry for a generation. The trains run on our tracks. The following broadcast is a strategic projection and analytical commentary based on current economic and geopolitical infrastructure dynamics. It does not depict real-time events and is intended strictly for educational and investment analysis purposes.